Merhaba, herkese iyi akşamlar diliyorum. Ben Yankı Enki. Siren Yayınları'nın şef editörüyüm ve bu akşam Kıraathane Kitap Şenliği kapsamında 2024'te yayınladığımız çarpıcı kitaplardan biri olan Dip Akıntıları'nın yazarı sevgili Kirsty Bell ile çok keyifli ve dokunaklı da olacağını düşündüğüm bir sohbet gerçekleştireceğiz. Çok kısaca Kirsty Bell hakkında biraz bilgi vermek istiyorum. Berlin'de yaşayan sanat eleştirmeni ve yazar Kirsty Bell'in yazıları Tate Etc. ve Art in America gibi mecralarda yayımlandı. 2011-2021 yılları arasında Frieze dergisinde editör olarak katkıda bulundu. The Artist House başlıklı kitabı görsel sanatlar alanındaki çalışmaları destekleyen Andy Warhol Vakfı tarafından teşvikle ödüllendirildi. Dünya çapında birçok önemli kurum ve müzenin sergi kataloglarında metinleriyle yer alan Kirsty Bell'in Dip Akıntıları adlı kitabı Yasemin Çonkar'ın çevirisiyle 2024'te Siren Yayınları tarafından yayınlandı. Sorularıma geçmeden önce Kıraathane'ye bu organizasyon için teşekkürlerimi iletmek istiyorum ve bu Türkçe girişin ardından müsaadenizle İngilizceye dönüp Kirsty ile sohbete e, geçiyorum. Hi Kirsty, thank you for joining.
Hello, thank you. It's great to be here.
I hope you're well. So this year we published a book, The Undercurrents. It is my favorite title so far. I read the book maybe three or four, maybe five times. I don't know, but for me, it is a kind of a book that you always keep by your side and always turn to and get inspiration. And when I read a book like that, I often think, good nonfiction is better literature than fiction. So welcome again. You are in Berlin now, but uh, actually, I don't know if you have ever been to Turkey, but
I have been once to Istanbul. Yeah.
really.
Yes. Yeah.
So maybe sometime in the future, I'd love to hear your thoughts about our cities, like Berlin, and landscapes and streets, and of course, uh, I wonder what would you see when you look through some Turkish windows instead of German ones. So the Undercurrents is a text that moves from the personal to the collective, weaving diverse areas such as histories, city planning, architecture, spirit of place together. In fact, you state that you see yourself as more of a seamstress rather than a historian. I'm curious to know how you developed this complex approach and how did the project and the inspiration come about?
I mean, in a quite a banal way, in fact, it began simply because I moved house in Berlin from the east side of the city to the house that I'm currently in now, where I'm sitting now, which is on the west side of the city, but looking towards the east. So all of a sudden, I had a different axis, I had a different viewpoint, and the things that I was seeing from the window were things that I hadn't really seen before and thought about before. So you know, it really just started with a question that came from me looking out of my window of the kitchen in my new apartment and thinking, oh, what is this that I'm seeing? And then also, what are the things that are no longer there? What kinds of things has this building witnessed in the 150 years of its history? You know, so it was a kind of personal sense of orientation in a way for me that began the process of research.
Berlin is a city that has many layers, and part of its history is engraved in Stolpersteine and numerous flags outside of buildings, informing everyone what kind of horror has taken place inside in the past, either in the Nazi era or in Eastern Germany. In this aspect, it is a city that talks to passers-by and constantly tells stories. What kind of role would you say that the specific character of the city of Berlin plays in the undercurrents? And do you think a similar approach would bring about an inquiry as profound as this if another city was at issue? Would you say that Berlin is unique in its background and history in any way?
I mean, I think Berlin is certainly unique in its character and history, but I also imagine that all cities are to an extent. Um, and my approach, which is a kind of close reading of the material around me. In this case, the city has very much to do with the difference, with the particularity. Like, what are the particularities that make Berlin, make us experience Berlin as we do, and I mean, obviously, everybody knows a lot about the history of Berlin because of its relation to the, major events of history of the 20th century. I think those take up so much space in in the popular imagination of what Berlin is as a city. It's really been defined by catastrophe, by violence, by upheaval, by also, devastation. And I think that part of what I was wanting to do was to look around that kind of big ink spot that takes up so much space, and think, oh, what was behind that, or not what was behind that, but what was before that, um, like how else can we think about this city beyond what we know of the Nazis in the Second World War, and so that was part of my endeavor, but also to think about like other parts of the history that haven't been told, the kinds of more minor sides of stories of the city that aren't to do with its politicians and its ideologies, but really more to do with inhabitation and what the experiences of ordinary people living in this city were 150 years ago, or 100 years ago, through these different eras of Berlin. But I mean, I kind of think that you could do this wherever you are. I think like any window you look out of gives you a story of some kind. If you kind of tune into that kind of reading, if you're really looking for things, and that was part of the basis of this book, was the fact that I was looking in this particular way. Partly, as I said, because I moved house, I had this new orientation onto the city, but also because of aspects in my personal life. My marriage was breaking up, and I'd been married to a German, and I'm British. I don't come from this city, so it was also, the question was, what is this place, and what is my relation to it? So I was looking in maybe a very exaggerated manner, like very highly tuned.
Your your previous book, The Artist's House, is an inquiry into artists and their homes and how their homes relate to their artistic creation processes. Was this in a way preparatory to write about the city where you live, along with its inhabitants at different timelines, leading different lives? Has your previous book inspired you in any way in the writing process of The Undercurrents?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think through experience, in the way that one experience opens you up to different ways of understanding. And that book, The Artist's House, it comes from my background in art criticism, obviously, but in a way was expanding this, the basis of my work as an art critic, I always see as this kind of form of close reading and analysis of whatever it is I'm looking at, whether it's an artwork or an installation, or it begins with the thing itself, and then in the Artist's House book, I expanded that to think about the container, of artists where the domestic is very involved in their practice in some way. So, um, you know, so um, so I was looking at, and very much thinking about the nature of inhabitation, where the boundaries between kind of everyday domestic existence and the making of art where those boundaries are become very porous, so it becomes more difficult to define where the art making ends and where the daily life begins. So I was really interested in that, and just thinking about. So I think that through that I became very kind of switched on to thinking about what happens inside a home. What are these different kinds of experience, and what kind of influence do they have on the inhabitant as well? So I mean, I really think that to turn that question that I was applying to these kind of 20 different artists and looking at their practice, to turn that into my own relation to my own home, definitely came from that. And there was one artist in particular, a British-French artist called Marc-Camille Chamovitz, who I was very, very close to his work. Sadly, he passed away earlier this year. But there's one photograph of him that where he's seen at the window of his apartment, photographed from the back and looking out. And that for me was kind of this image that I had in my mind also that I brought with me to the writing of this book, as I found myself in this position so often, standing at the window looking out, and in a way kind of forming this or becoming this boundary between the personal interior of the home and then this public exterior of the city.
I think we will be talking more about this inner and out, the boundary and the domestic space and the public space. But before coming to that, I want to ask you about the metaphor of water. So the metaphor of water plays a key role from the very first page of the book, and in my opinion, it is the basis of the narrative. So while I was reading, I always thought that I was reading a narrative of expression based on underground waters, water seeping through the walls, puddles and pools that suddenly form. So when you noticed the water seeping through the wall, or when you started writing, did you have this metaphor in mind during the whole writing process? I mean, did you try to stick to it, to the metaphor, or was it just a starting point?
Um, that's an interesting question, because it was a starting point, because of the fact that in this new apartment that I was living in, there were all of these different problems with water, so it was very much in my mind. And also because the apartment is looking out of the window at the Landwehr Canal here. So there was water outside and water inside. But on the metaphorical level of it, strangely, I really wasn't conscious of that at all as I was writing it, that it was playing such a big role. I didn't really think about it. I definitely didn't think about it as being a metaphor, because for me it was more circumstantial. This is what's happened. It was just a response to the circumstance, and writing that, that forming kind of the basis of the narrative. So it's a little mysterious to me. And also because Berlin is not a place that where you think about water an awful lot, to be honest. There is this big river, the River Spree, but it doesn't play a big role. It's not like the Bosphorus in Istanbul, or the Thames in London, or the Seine. The River Spree in Berlin is very nondescript. It doesn't have much character. So it's not an obvious way to look at the city. And I think it was it was really just something that was happening on a more subconscious level, but definitely also has to do with this question of permeability, of what happens when the walls of your home suddenly become porous, and the boundary that's separating the inside and outside is not so reliable anymore. And that was like, that's something that carries on throughout the book. But it was not a conscious strategy in any way. But then on the other hand, I think because I was thinking about water because of these circumstantial things, then maybe I was more alert to it. So then those watery aspects kind of found their home in the narrative more easily.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't expect that actually. So because I mean, I asked you if you try to stick to the metaphor because while I was reading, I stick to the water metaphor because in my own life, while I was reading it, the undercurrents, I've been facing some similar water problems in my house, and I I I, I started to question myself and my marriage and my own life, private life. So I always kept that water metaphor in mind. So the next question is about the water thing again. So because
Mhm.
it was important for me, and as we just mentioned, the water element is a leitmotif of the undercurrents, at least for me. So it's a dichotomy, nature taking its course against the culture and the will of the individuals. The text starts with water damage in the apartment, as you said, and flows through timelines and personal or collective histories from different times. I would like to ask you about your quote, water always finds a way. In this context, is this a straightforward statement or does it have a fatalistic implications in regard to how events develop and narratives get shaped? To take this step further, just as the water has its own course, does the history of the place that we live in also have a similar effect, imposing the weight of the past on us?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I do think it's true. It's true that water finds its way, water always will flow somewhere. But I also think that it can be influenced, like the flow of water can be influenced. And if the water in a house, for instance, is coming inside, that's because there's a problem that needs to be fixed. So if you fix the problem, then that no longer happens. And I think perhaps you could apply the same thinking to the weight of history, which is also a problem or an issue with porousness. How much space does the past take up in the present? How much is it seeping in to the present? And I think that those things aren't fixed. Those things are also fluid, and it also has to do with repair somehow. If the past is full of trauma that hasn't been addressed and it's still broken, then maybe uh, it will be very present. It will be flooding over the present day. I mean, I'm just speaking off the top of my head now. I don't know if this is really true, but I think that if the past is addressed in a conscious way and in that sense kind of diverted, then then it doesn't swamp the present. So yeah, so I think it has to do with responsibility, uh, and the responsibility to make sure that the past or the water is flowing in the right direction. That it's not taking over areas where it shouldn't actually be.
I see in the undercurrents both the biographical story of a woman who starts to realize that something is accumulating, as you mentioned before, and overflowing in her own life, and the story of the things accumulating and overflowing in the past of a city. So I think this is a story of damage. I see a damaged woman, damaged wife, mother at one side, and a damaged building within a damaged city. Did any of these come to the fore while writing, or put it more briefly, did you write about yourself, or did you write about Berlin?
Well, I mean, I had no interest in writing about myself, to be honest. This is the first piece of writing that I've done that goes beyond the arena of art criticism. And in art criticism, the personal I doesn't really have much place. So yeah, I was really interested in writing about Berlin, and answering a question for myself of why it's such a strange, difficult city, what this particular energy is of the city. But as through this process of writing, as I realized that that it was so personal, that it was kind of this personal uh, questioning and a very subjective viewpoint. Literally that the window of my own house is super, super subjective. So with that, a lot of things are being cut out, excluded from the frame. So at a certain point, I realized that that because it was subjective and personal, that part of the story belonged in the book, actually. So this part of the frame was the fact that my marriage was breaking up and I was in this city as an outsider, and so in a way I kind of pulled the camera back to be in the frame myself, because that subjectivity had to have a body in a way, had to be some kind of three-dimensional person. But that was that was quite new for me as a writer, and not a threshold that I had to kind of come over to write about myself, because I don't think that story is particularly interesting, to be honest. It's a breakup story. It's quite generic in a way, and it doesn't actually, there's not actually a lot of detail about that in the book, but it's more of a frame, to answer the question why. Why is this person looking out of her window so much? Like, what's going on? Like, what's the problem? And yeah, and in the way that the interior and the exterior do kind of exchange and mirror in many ways throughout the book. That I think that what you say is right. I was feeling damaged. My house was feeling damaged, and the city is obviously damaged. And that's the thing about a city like Berlin. You don't have to look very far or scratch the surface very deeply for evidence of damage to appear. The damage is all around us.
I'm a huge fan of Gothic fiction, and I'm so happy and proud to be the editor of Shirley Jackson books in Turkey. And Shirley Jackson was one of the greatest writers of haunted house story. So being a fan of Gothic fiction and ghost stories, and having studied Gothic literature for my master's thesis, our relationship with the past and reviving the buried fascinates me. And looking for from this perspective, the undercurrents also fascinate me as a narrative of trauma and the way it deals. I mean, the way you deal with the traces of the past. So in the book, you seem to be focusing on the issues of traumas, the past, and searching for something hidden or something invisible or unseen. And actually, I will describe it, the undercurrents, as a cultural ghost story. So it's both about the terrors of a society and anxieties of a woman, and also about the questions of a stranger in a strange land, like you said, an outsider. And Gothic fiction often deals with the Freudian uncanny, the stranger becoming the master of the house, the outsider becoming the familiar, and vice versa. And the ambivalence arises, and there's something both disturbing and appealing, and both frightening and attracting at the same time. So coming back to the undercurrents, there are many paragraphs that remind me. There are many lines that I underlined that remind me the Gothic perspective, which I call this Gothic actually. So the undercurrents of the city seem to be the disturbing unconscious, and they are coming back from the past, I assume. So anyway, at the end of the book, you seem to make peace. You try to make peace with the past. And what can you say about Berlin or Germany's relationship with the past? Is it still haunted with traumas?
Uh, First of all, I love that relation with Gothic fiction. Nobody's ever brought that up before, but I'm very, it's very appealing. And actually, I've never read Shirley Jackson, so I immediately want to go and read all of her books. And it is a bit of a haunted house story, in Berlin. I mean, it is haunted by its past, and in a very literal sense, but also in this other less obvious sense where there are certain areas of the city where you get a you just feel that something has happened there. It might not be visible in some way, but there's this kind of energetic feeling which is very difficult to talk about without sounding esoteric. But many people experience that here. So I mean, I think in a way, this writing this book was less an attempt to make peace with the past than the present, to accept the city as it is, accept the fact. So my cat is just coming onto the screen here. This is very appropriate for this gothic.
Yeah.
um, to yeah, I mean, to recognize that Berlin is traumatized, and to, through that recognition, have more compassion for it as a difficult place. I mean, I think that was definitely the experience that I've had, in this piece of research, that the more I would uncover about events, for instance, that happened right here outside my front door, the more I would understand how horrific it was, and that makes so that the population, I mean, it was inevitably traumatized through those experiences, plus compounded with the guilt that came at the end of the Second World War. It's highly complex. So the more you can look into that complexity and try and understand it, then the less haunted it is, because those things that are being suppressed become visible, and then you can recognize them and understand them. So for me, the process of writing it was kind of just coming to terms with the place that I'm at, as it is, with all of its flaws, like any place.
It is interesting that this book is, on the one hand, concentrating on one of the history's most dynamic countries, full of historical milestones, the Second World War and the Wall. So on the other hand, you frequently bring forward some so-called New Age themes like Feng Shui or astrology or family constellations, which has been recently a trendy topic in Turkey as well. So uh, I think throughout the narrative, there is always a metaphysical
Mhm.
side as opposed to that historical and social, political and social framework. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, those are the parts of the book that some readers have the most problems with, the so-called new agey
Yeah.
aspects, which I think is a bit disappointing, really, because you don't have to agree with them to. Well, anyway, this is a personal thing. Like, for me, I'm not really invested in feng shui or astrology or family constellation or any of those um, practices. But for me, they're all interesting as ways to kind of manifest this metaphysical side, because I'm definitely interested in the effect of things that are not visible. All of these things that you can't see that nevertheless have an effect. Like I was just saying about these areas of the city where there's a tangible undercurrent of um, um, trauma or destruction of something, but you can't see it anymore. So what is that? What is that energy? How can you describe it, and how can it be manifest? And for me, these like feng shui, for instance, which I really don't know a lot about. I'm not not by I've just read a couple of books. I'm really just don't have a deep knowledge of it. But for me, it's very interesting because it's based in observation. The whole practice of feng shui, it's not actually esoteric at all. It's based in observation of geology and weather patterns, in terms of where the best place is to site your house. What's going to be the most auspicious, the most prosperous in terms of the site itself. And that to me just seems really useful, like a useful kinds of information. And I think that it's, in its popular understanding in the Western um, countries, it's been a bit kind of put into this esoteric corner, but I don't necessarily think that's true. But so for me, it's a way of like a way of reading, as is all these different kinds of divination. They're ways of reading and of manifesting or making a kind of diagram of something that's not necessarily visible in an obvious way. Family constellation does the same thing. It's a way of making a diagram through something that is kind of deeply buried. And I'm just fascinated in that because I'm really interested in the invisible and how to give it some kind of form. And and in this book, the question was how to write about these, how to write about energy without just sounding uh, uh, flimsy and wishy-washy. So so that's what led me to look into those kind of
Yeah,
areas, and but definitely to do with the metaphysical. I'm really interested in that.
yeah, I'm interested in that metaphysical perspectives too, because actually I read some negative reviews about undercurrents mentioning this, new age stuff, and uh, so for me, that parts about the family constellations, for example, was the most, you know, uh, inspiring parts of the book for me. So because I didn't expect that. I didn't expect that the issue with Berlin and the history of the city will be connected to an individual's, search for answers, or, confronting the past. And so I didn't expect that. It was a huge enlightenment. Uh,
I didn't expect it either, to be honest.
yeah,
It, it,
it
yeah,
makes sense. Yes.
yeah.
So this and the Undercurrents is a book that compares, as we said, or maybe juxtaposes or confronts the past and the present. So if you think about Kirsty in the past and Kirsty today, how do you think there's a difference between the writer who hasn't yet written this book and the one who had written it? So this book, as an essay, as an example of creative writing, just like water finding its way, transforms things and transforms ideas or perspective. And probably you have been, maybe you have felt some transformation within yourself. So did actually I wanted to ask this: did you feel transformed as a woman, as an individual, as an art critic, maybe, or as a writer, of course?
I mean, I think that the time that it took to write this book, there was an inevitable kind of change or transformation, in that I came out of this very difficult period of my life when my family broke up, and that kind of over time became more less painful, more normal. Me and my children, we all adjusted to this new situation. So that was a transformation that happened parallel to the writing process. But I think the biggest transformation was as a writer, because as I said earlier, previously I come out of a background in art criticism, which is a very different kind of writing. I think it's also very creative, but it sticks more closely to the subject matter, to its purpose in a way. And this for me was like a big, it was a big new step into something different, to write about this much broader subject that has a broader uh, audience, I suppose. Contemporary art criticism is a relatively niche subject, you could
Yeah.
say. Um, so that, I mean, it's been really exciting, to be honest, to have a much broader readership has been wonderful, and also just to uh, uh, to have made it work, because I didn't know at the beginning or as I was writing it if it was going to work or not, or if it was going to, as you don't when you're writing something, you don't know if this thing that's important to you is going to be important to anybody else or if they're going to be able to understand what you're saying. You just don't really know that in the writing process. And, so for me to have had such positive resonance from the book, from people who are living here, who understand what I'm trying to say and agree with me and say, oh, it's so good to see that written down because I felt that myself, that's been incredible. And the book was translated into German, and I've had a very positive response from German readers of all different generations. So, just in terms of feeling a personal relevance of my practice, that's been that's been really transformative and exciting, and also for me now to have a Turkish readership is this other like completely unanticipated but kind of wonderful result. And I'm fascinated to know I mean, there's a big Turkish population in Berlin, and it would be wonderful. It's wonderful to think there may be some Turkish families here or individuals are reading the book and maybe it's responding to it. But I'm also curious about, where you are. And I mean, yeah, and none of that was anticipated. So that's been just, yeah, very rewarding, I would say. Yeah.
As Siren Publishing, we like to publish works in which genres are intertwined. So we are known for our special interest in works where fiction and non-fiction intersect. So I don't know if it is because of this, maybe because the undercurrents is an biographical narrative, but I have witnessed that some readers in Turkey define this book as a novel. So
Mm.
have you received such a comment before? And what do you think about the view that the undercurrents is a non-fiction that proceeds or develops like a work of fiction?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and also that came up with the German translation because um, it's actually been published as a non-fiction book in Germany, but everybody that I know who's read it in German has said it's a Roman, it's a novel. um, but I think that there's this other, I don't know. There's this other kind of useful genre now that's come up recently in English language uh, literature, which is narrative nonfiction.
Yeah.
You know, and that's definitely what this book is. So it's like I don't feel at all like it's for me a novel is fiction, like it's made up. And for me, this book isn't made up. I don't feel like I have the imagination, like that kind of imagination that can make up a story. That's not the writer I am. Um, I need something to build on. I need some like building blocks of fact. And so for me, this isn't it's not made up. It's fiction, but it's highly speculative and highly personal, and that's where the narrative aspect of it comes in. So I think that it really sits on the boundaries between those two things, and I think I really feel like that's an interesting place to be, right on the borderline where you can take the bits from both sides that you're most interested in.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But probably for a writer, if I wrote something like that and people think that it is fiction, so it's so interesting. Yes, and this will be my last question for tonight. And when an author is being interviewed, it is inevitable to ask whether she is currently working on something or what her next project is. So I'm going to ask this cliche too, but I'd like to add that although I've asked this question many times to many writers, I think you're the author whose next work I'm most curious about. And I'm saying this from the bottom of my heart, really. I really wonder what awaits us Kirsty Bell readers after the undercurrents.
Well, I am working on something new, and I think that this came out of a little loose end that was still unresolved from the undercurrents. I mean, it's definitely builds on the kind of research I did here, but I've gone kind of moving to something that's in a way closer to me and more personal in that I'm going away from Berlin and Germany, but back to Scotland where my family is from. And I'm writing a book that has to do with my own kind of matriarchal ancestry, with these women in my family who come from the lowlands of Scotland. Um, in a way, it's something much closer to me, but actually, I know even less about my family and these women in the lowlands of Scotland than I did about Berlin when I started writing the Berlin book. So uh, it's even more speculative. And there's a lot more stitching together of big holes in the narrative, and actually quite a lot of kind of gothic imagining in there too. Yeah, definitely. Also, you said before that thing about gothic fiction of being the stranger in the strange land, and because my mother's family is from Scotland, but she now lives in England, and we don't have any relatives there anymore. That my grandparents have both passed away. We don't have a place there anymore. So I've been going back there a lot to research, but I also feel very much like this stranger in a strange land. On the one hand, I feel a very strong sense of it being my country, my place. I feel very connected to it, but on the other hand, I really don't know it very well. So, yeah, I'm in the middle of that, and yeah, we'll see where it leads.
It's great, great news. Thank you for sharing, and very exciting.
Thank you.
So, uh, thank you, Kirsty. It was a great pleasure talking with you. So I hope we see each other, maybe in Turkey. So I don't know, maybe in Berlin. So once again, thank you very much and have a nice evening.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation.